You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
Back in 2020, I decided to move from being a technology operator to a technology investor. My aim when I came here and started Jedar Capital was to focus on trying to be the bridge between the West and the East. They don't know about Africa. The word ends at Europe, and then it's very hard to find people who understand what's going on in emerging markets. On one side, there was this rise in the interest from the African diaspora to know more about their origins and start supporting entrepreneurs and founders in Africa.
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, Tessa Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find amazing people who are doing amazing things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today, we have another special guest. We have Sherif Nessim, who is a technology professional with over 24 years of experience and is also founder of Jedar Capital, which is an Africa-focused VC firm focusing on early-stage startups from pre-seed to Series A. Welcome to the podcast, Sherif. How are you?
Hi, Tercer. I'm good. Happy to be with you today.
It's great to have you on the podcast. How's your day going?
Yeah, all good. Just starting the day. So yeah, fresh and, ready.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
As you know, I always like to start a podcast from the beginning. So I was hoping you could introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about Sherif Nessim.
Yeah, so I'm Sherif Nessim. I'm born and raised in Egypt. I'm an engineer by education. So I've done electrical engineering back in Egypt. I've worked all my life in technology. It's my passion, really. I mean, looking at technology and how it can solve our problems or help us lead a better life. I've been working in emerging markets since I graduated. I joined first a technology company. It's called Orascom Telecom. It's in Egypt, working in emerging markets in North Africa, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and some parts of Africa. So I joined them early on after graduation back in 1998. Sounds very old. So I spent like 6 or 7 years in the enterprise sector first, and then I moved to the telecom world in 2005, joining one of their subsidiaries. So I spent most of my career early on working and understanding emerging markets, different regions like Southeast Asia, North Africa, Middle East, and Africa. But again, I developed my understanding for I would say the underserved and how technology can help these communities that is definitely full of problems and infrastructure issues and so on, where technology is key to solve problems there and definitely make our lives better.
Thank you for that. So you've given us great insights in terms of born and raised in Egypt. You're an engineer, worked in technology with a focus on emerging markets, which has led you to what you're doing now. You're the founder of Jedar Capital. Can you tell us about the company and the work that you're currently doing in Africa?
Yeah, of course. I started Jedar Capital back in 2020 when I moved to the States. So before that, I lived all my life and worked out of Egypt, traveling a lot across emerging markets. But 2020, I decided to move from being a technology operator to a technology investor. So 2020, I started Jedar Capital here in US when I moved. And in the beginning, it's not really a fund. It was more of a network connecting individuals that are interested to understand more about emerging markets and specifically Africa and invest into startups there. For me, it was more of a bridge between the West and I would say the global South in general, emerging markets like Africa and Southeast Asia. And these essentially are the areas or the geographies where I used to work with Orascom. So I wanted to capitalize on this and leverage on my network and connections and understanding of these regions and try to help the startups coming out of this area. So we've been operating as a syndicate for the past 3 years, focusing on early stage startups in different sectors. We were really sector agnostic, looking at different areas and sectors across these geographies. And we've done already around 18 investments the past 2.5 or 3 years now. The majority are in Africa. So we've done maybe 4 or 5 in Southeast Asia and mainly in Pakistan and Bangladesh. But the rest of the investments are focused all over Africa, north, east, south, west. So that's the focus. Now we're trying to shift and move into being a VC firm with a VC fund that we're currently raising. The focus will change a little bit. So probably we'll focus more into exclusively on Africa rather than emerging markets in general. And we're looking at specific sectors as well. So that's about the company and how I shifted or moved from being into technology operator and transforming into technology investor, as I say.
Fantastic. So you mentioned that you started a company in 2020 when you moved to the States.
Yeah.
What was the motivation behind this move?
The move was actually personal. So it wasn't like the plan to leave the region and come here to US and start the firm if I'm investing into back in the Middle East and emerging markets. So it was really family and personal reasons. But still, I see the silver lining behind it because, again, my aim when I came here and started Jedar Capital was to focus on trying to be the bridge, as I said, between the West and the East. And I think being physically here present in the States and trying to speak to a lot of people who are interested to invest in the region back in Africa or even just understand and get to know more about what's going on in Africa and the tech startup scene and so on. I think being physically present here and maybe getting to meet people and so on, apart from, of course, I came during COVID, so maybe the first year it was online anyways, but I think later on when we started to, get into in-person again in 2021 or 2022, I think it made a difference. When you're trying to speak to people and bring them like the experience of what Africa looks like now and what's going on there and why it is a region where, everybody should consider like investing in, especially if you're into emerging markets. So I think physically being here, it made a difference. And I would say that, that have been the silver lining for me moving here as well.
Interesting. So how have you found it managing an Africa-focused VC firm whilst being based in the States?
It's actually during COVID, it has proved, I think, that the model works. Most of the VCs and the investors, I think, when COVID happened, they thought that probably they would slow down because they're used to either the startup need to fly and we need to sit and speak together on the table in person, or we have to go as well and explore different opportunities. But a lot of people actually, or I would say all VCs, they didn't stop actually investing and they've kept investing without meeting the founders. And this has been now the norm. But again, I think an important factor for me is that I consider myself still there in the region. Again, yes. Having worked there for more than 25 years before moving to the States, my network is there, my connections is there, the understanding that I've built to the region, how business is operating there, how the scene is, and so on. I think this kept me close. I think I'm still very close now. Every morning when I get up, my agenda is calls and Zoom calls with the region. It's either I'm on a call with like a startup in Africa, in Nigeria, or in Kenya, or in Egypt, and so on. So I'm still very connected. So I don't think that being here is a challenge for me, working with African startups or companies from the region.
So outside of, say, some of the challenges of managing a VC firm outside of the continent, what challenges have you had to overcome in order to create a fund that is targeted at the African market?
I had mixed, I would say, experiences in this regard. So again, I mean, it depends on who are you targeting in terms of investors. Again, working with investors here when I came, in the beginning, I found out that, yeah, people, they don't know about Africa. The word ends at Europe, and then it's very hard and it's very rare to find people who understand really what's going on in emerging markets and so on. So I think it was mixed experiences. There was this on one side, there was this, I would say, rise in the interest from the African diaspora to know more about their origins, look into Africa and start supporting entrepreneurs and founders in Africa again. And on the other side, there was the traditional, I would say, investors that I'm targeting to tell them about Africa and educate them. So it was a lot of education for this, I would say, latter group. And that was okay. I knew that building this, it needs to have like a long-term approach when I was trying to build the network of investors in the syndicate, in Jedar Capital syndicate. So at the beginning, we were doing a lot of educational webinars. We're not presenting any startup. We're just discussing specific topics around Africa. So just to get them to know, understand, I mean, we're discussing the mobile penetration and how, for example, mobile money is in Africa is one of the leading regions globally. So it was more of educational sessions and webinar just to get them to understand more about Africa. And then later on, gradually, I mean, you get these investors excited about the regions. And many of them actually have been doing the first investment outside the US through Jedar Capital in Africa. And this was one of my targets, actually, and one of the things that I was keen on. I wanted to be the bridge, as I said, and I wanted to be the vehicle to enable people who are interested into the continent, but maybe they don't have access to come and be able to invest and look at startups and support startups in the region through this vehicle, Jedar Capital Syndicate.
So you mentioned one of the challenges is that people don't know much about Africa and a lot of education was required. So what's some common misconceptions or challenges you've observed when Western investors are looking at the African market?
I think one of the things is they look at Africa as one big country.
Yes.
And they don't realize that they need to understand definitely the local culture and market in every country. Actually, they will approach. Every country is different. And even some people think that, okay, I mean, we understand that the regions are different, and they start to look at main regions like East Africa, West Africa, North Africa, and South, and so on. And they think that each of these four main regions, they come with a common set of characteristics, which is not true. Again, even on the east side of Africa, I mean, every country is really different, and they need to look at each country alone with the understanding that they need definitely to focus on the expansion. So it's looking into a specific country to start with, and then trying to understand the natural expansion. And that's the edge of Africa as well, is it's a huge population. So whenever you start in a single country, that's not the end. You're tapping into the entry point for the market that you are targeting. And then later on, you try to understand another country, different culture, adapt the product and expand. And sooner these startups can be operating in maybe 7 or 8 or 9 countries or even more. Another thing is which I think it's a misconception as well, that they think that ready and off-the-shelf products and solutions that may be launched elsewhere in the world, like in Europe or US or maybe other emerging markets as well, can work. I mean, it's easily or without localization, where I think that you need to look at the specifics of the country and adapt even proven business models or successful products in other areas. You need to adapt it because I think it's totally different. And that's why I think that most of the successful companies are actually homegrown solutions across Africa. And this is something I think that, investors have started to realize and understand about the continent.
I agree. I guess a lot of the misconceptions are built around the perception to risk in Africa. So how do you approach risk assessment and risk management when considering potential investment opportunities in African startups?
Again, it reflects as part of the due diligence that we do. So again, in VC in general, so venture capital investments is risky by nature, regardless of the place. So, I mean, it's as risky as investing in Europe or anything. But definitely there are some specific that is reflected in the kind of diligence that we do, given the specific challenges to Africa. So one of these challenges, I think, that is maybe specific into Africa is sometimes the lack of capital. So to mitigate this risk, you need to understand as well the kind of capital this startup or the business model that this startup in Africa is adopting. You need to be very careful in I would say, capital intensive startups, because again, you need to think in the future and consider as well that capital can be scarce at any point of time, as opposed to maybe other areas or other regions like in Europe or US. So I think it's part of, I would say, the risk management itself, or the assessment is part of the due diligence, where you look at the business model, the market size, and so on, and the details of the business model, the unit economics, and how fast is this startup able to be kind of sustainable and not being too prone to, I would say, the need to keep going and raise more and more capital in the future to keep going.
Definitely. I guess before you carry out risk assessment and management for investments, you need to have startups ready to invest in. So how do you tend to identify or build your pipeline of promising early stage startups for investment?
I think the past 3 years working as a syndicate and investing as well. So we've invested, as I said, in 18 startups the past 3 years. 14 of them actually are in Africa. So we have already developed a relation with a lot of founders. So the 14 founders that we invested in, plus, of course, the other founders that we looked at before investing in these 14. So we have like a network of founders that bring us actually deals and refer deals. 50% now, or even more, of the startups are actually referrals from within our network there, whether founders or other local VC firms or accelerators on the ground. Also, I used to travel a lot. So, I mean, at least every quarter somewhere in Africa. So I'm still very close to the ecosystem players in different areas. And I try actually every quarter to at least visit one new country in Africa that I've never visited before, just to understand it, spend some time on the ground, connect to the local players there, which again feeds into the pipeline. And it's important, I mean, to be sure that you have local partners or local people that you trust on the ground once you're starting to develop your pipeline. So that's how we went about it. And I think now we have access to a decent pipeline that is strong and initially vetted from local people across the continent where we focus, or the different countries where we focus at.
Brilliant. So you mentioned that a lot of the startups in your pipeline come from your local partners and people on the ground. When you get to that stage of moving companies from pipeline to potential investments, what factors do you consider when selecting these companies that you're interested in supporting?
Definitely founders. So it's always, the people. So founders. We spend a lot of time trying to understand, the personality and the people themselves before even looking into the product or what they're building. We need to understand how they operate. I spend the first call with any founder without them pitching the product. We just speak. I get to know them. They get to know me. And I always think that there is a far more important step before looking into, product market fit and whether there is a need for this product or not, which is the investor founder fit. So it's very important to spend some time understanding the founders and connecting to them as human beings, and also for them to get to know me as well and my journey and as an individual. I mean, it's not as Jedar Capital, but I want them to understand and know more about Sherif, and I want to know more about them. And we make sure that there is this chemistry that we can work together and look at specific traits as well of, understanding whether this is a kind of person that can be resilient. Definitely, it's a tough journey building a startup, and there will be a lot of downs, and you need to assess the founders on this aspect. So that's the first thing that probably I spend a lot of time in. And if we feel that, there is this, I would say, the investor founder fit, we move and look into the product. And so definitely the business model is something we look at. The unit economics, we need to look at a business that can be sustainable in the future. So maybe it needs funding for the first 2 or 3 years, but then it can reach where it can generate enough revenue to keep going. Maybe without funding, they will slowly grow, but still they can survive. And then you can put the capital just to help them grow fast. The market size as well, it's one crucial area that we look at. We don't like products that are built to address niche markets. We love the approach of, building for the bottom of the pyramid or the masses. So we need to look at a huge target market. Also, the capability of this team as well as product to expand beyond the country where they started. So even if there's, let's say, starting in Kenya or Nigeria or Uganda or wherever, we assess a lot whether this solution can be replicated, and it's not a problem specific to this country, but it's something that can actually expand into many countries across Africa. So these are the main factors that we look at once we get excited about a specific startup that we can consider investing in.
Interesting. So earlier you mentioned that you've invested in 18 startups in the last 2 years. So far, how much capital have you deployed to African startups?
So collectively, as a syndicate, as I said, for the 18 investments that we have done, we deployed close to $3 million. And I think probably close to 2 million were actually in 13 or 14 startups in Africa.
Brilliant. And which sectors do these startups tend to be in, and why?
For this syndicate, consciously, we decided to be sector agnostic for the past 3 years. And I personally wanted to do investments in different sectors to understand the scene in Africa, get exposed to different sectors, and also to discover which sector I can support better than others. So for me, I was keen to explore different. We've done fintech, e-commerce, logistics, mobility and transportation. We've done things around health tech. We've even done a biotech company, which is definitely, it's a domain that, it's tough to do and hard definitely for Africa. But we've even done that as well. So again, we've looked into different sectors the past 3 years. Now we're trying to maybe focus a little bit more, again, having built this experience, understanding about the markets, understanding about the sectors where we are able to definitely support and bring value to the startups or our portfolio companies. We started to focus on specific sectors now that we're moving into the fund.
So you touched on something key there, which was in terms of your ability to bring value to the startups that you're working with. So how do you believe Jedar Capital differs from other Africa-focused VCs, and what value do you believe that you add to these startups?
Yeah, I think I'm trying to bring different value. I think the leverage that I come from an operator background that have worked on the ground in Africa and Middle East and in emerging markets in general. I think this is one of the key advantages or differentiators against other VCs who they understand investment, but not necessarily have done it as an operator or operated a company. So this is one of the things I'm trying to leverage on. As I said, spending more than 24 years working in the continent. That's one of the areas. Again, the network, we're trying to leverage our network and connections. So we help as well on the business development side. So especially in specific sectors, that's why we decided to focus on specific sectors. So again, business development efforts that we can support the startups on by connecting them to maybe specific corporates across Africa that can come in as partners, maybe channel and distribution partners, mobile operators, where I spent most of my career actually building relations with different telcos across the areas. So we're trying to bring this network and value to the portfolio companies. We're also, as a team, we're trying to build as well, I would say, a practice around PR and communication, which is something we think that a lot of startups lack. Now, when you search for any startup, the only article you will find probably is the raise announcements. That's it. But you never find them positioning themselves as subject matter experts, where you can find like article or piece of literature speaking about what they're doing, the industry, analyzing the sector where they are, which is important. So this is something as well we're trying to figure out how to build it. I have a partner now that joined the fund as well. She's focused on the PR and strategic communication, and she's trying to build this practice and see how she can develop a strategic plan for all portfolio companies that we invest in, so that they are in the press, on the spotlight, but not necessarily only when they raise, but to position themselves as founders and as team, as a company, as well as people who understand the sector that they are in, and bring knowledge and analytics and data and insights on this industry as well. So there are different, as I said, different aspects and different parts that we're trying to put together to position ourselves as doing things differently than other VCs.
That's great to hear. So you touched on your ability to leverage on your experience as an operator, business development, and also your network. So I was wondering if you could share some success stories of, say, startups that Jedar Capital has invested in and how your involvement has potentially contributed to their growth.
I think one of the edges that we've been able to do is to leverage the cross-pollination across partnerships between different startups. Again, we've made several connections between different startups that actually were complementary to each other. So they were not necessarily competing, but in a lot of cases, actually, when they partnered together, each in its own country, actually, they were able to expand faster. And instead of maybe developing a specific part or addressing a specific area, growing through partnership is something that is, for me, I'm a big believer in this. And I've practiced this actually during my career at the telco company where I worked, where in a lot of cases, actually, we launched products through strategic partners in different countries. So I did a lot of this, like connecting startups together in different countries to complement each other. I think also the support that we give whenever things go bad as well is, for me, one of the success stories was this stage where a company needed to think about the pivot and how we can change our positioning in the market. And being there and trying to help them, and then seeing that they can walk through it and, get out with the new model. This is something as well that I'm proud that we were involved. I remember one of these companies, actually, I was in Kenya at that time, and we spent, me and the founder, like 2 or 3 hours, 3 hours at their office. The founder went to the whiteboard and he kept thinking how to reach a better, I would say, positioning for the product, as they were considering to pivot due to several, I would say, changes in the markets at that time. These are some of the, I'd say, support that we have been doing to startups.
Fantastic. So it's clear that you have great insight into what makes an investable startup and how a startup should position itself in order to successfully raise money. So what advice would you give to African startups who are looking to raise capital or investment?
Number one, I think to be grounded, humble, and reasonable. I mean, in terms of how fast in the beginning they want to raise and, go and raise big amounts of money and so on. One of the things in Africa is that you can do a lot with less compared to other regions. So I always encourage them to go for small raises in the beginning, like maybe, a small pre-seed round, work towards a defined set of KPIs or milestones. Once they get there, they move to the other round. Because a lot of startups, they get excited and they want to raise like a big amount of money. They spend a lot of time there raising, sometimes more than 6-7 months in the beginning, which is a time that definitely they should spend on building the product and maybe trying different iterations of the product. So I always tell them, especially early on when you're doing your first round or maybe the second round, really raise small rounds and make sure that you set for yourself a specific and clear and defined KPI or milestone that you want to hit before moving to the other step. And it's always good as well from the perspective of the investors as well, to see the company that they have achieved something with the capital that they raised before. It's very important. So to communicate this as well to the investors that we have raised this amount, even if it's a family and friend round. And we moved and we achieved this milestone. And now we're raising to do this or this new milestone and so on. So yeah, these are, I think, the main advices I would give to specifically early stage startups that are looking to raise capital.
That's great advice. For startups who might be interested in approaching you, what are your future investment plans? Do you have any plans of raising another fund for additional investment?
Yeah, now we're raising now already our first fund. So as I said, we've moved from investing out of the syndicate the past 3 years, and now we're transforming into a VC firm, essentially, with the first fund, and definitely there would be definitely fund two and so on. But yeah, currently we're almost in the first close for the fund, and probably by end of the year, we'll start to deploy out of the fund.
Brilliant. And this fund will be specifically Africa focused?
Yeah, it is Africa focused, and yeah, we're looking at specific sectors as well. So it has a specific mandate around Africa as well.
So I guess for people who are listening, who are wondering what is the buzz or what is the advantage or opportunities in the African market, from your perspective, what would you say are the unique advantages and opportunities for startups operating in Africa compared to other parts of the world?
I think the idea that Africa, or the fact that Africa is really an untapped market in many areas. So a lot of sectors actually are still in the very early beginning of being developed. So this creates definitely a huge opportunity for startups to build different products and solutions addressing different problems. Another thing which is, definitely a key driver about Africa as well is the huge and growing population. And it's not only the number of the population, but as well the demographics or the classification of this population, which is, characterized by, it's the youngest population globally. By 2050, I think Africa is expected to probably surpass 2.5 billion population. That's huge. And the majority of this is actually in the working age sector, which means, these are people who are tech savvy. They want to use technology. They want to work. They want to build stuff. They want to, consume their customers and so on. So I think that's a huge potential currently and for the future as well, because I think Africa is the fastest growing. And I think by 2050, they would be contributing, I think, more than 40% of the global working age people will be in Africa. So that's huge. That create as well a huge opportunity, whether from the founder side, like these people are the tech savvy people who will be building companies, or even from the other side, that these will be the consumers for the future. So you look at a continent that has a huge market for even international companies to consider coming into and establish businesses there in Africa.
So you touched on some key points there in terms of the huge opportunities for startups to find solutions, growing population as well. So from your perspective, which sectors or industries do you see as the most promising in terms of startups being able to make significant strides or the most impact?
There are a lot of sectors, I think. Again, as I said, it's an untapped market. But I think for the next maybe 10 years, I think there are some sectors that have shown that, needs to be looked at. I think food security and agriculture, that's the main sector for Africa. It's important as well internally for the development, and again, given the huge growth in the population and the expectations to continue growing. So I think that these are sectors that are important, the food security and the agri-tech. Also, I think climate and renewable energy. We see a lot of energy problems across different countries, load sharing and power cuts, and a lot of areas that actually they lack the traditional infrastructure, the power infrastructure. So again, I think climate or renewable energy sector can solve problems like this and make sure that we're able to develop faster than the traditional I would say power infrastructure approach. There are also the traditional, I would say, sector that have been, which is the financial services. I think it will remain a core and fundamental area because, again, that's the base or the building block for any kind of service. I think we're just now seeing a shift towards empowering more the financial infrastructure rather than direct fintech services, like, for example, payment or buy now, pay later, and so on. It's more now into the enablement and availing a financial infrastructure. So startups are now trying to realize and build this more than building, the neobanks and the buy now, pay laters and so on. It's building infrastructure where people can tap into specific financial platforms and then they avail services. So it's more into the embedded finance, as I said, and the financial infrastructure itself that can enable other platforms. Also, I think with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement coming into effect last year, I think a lot of attention will go towards the digital trade enabling platforms, how we can enable trade to happen in a more efficient way, whether in a single country or more essentially between different countries across Africa. And I'm a big advocate of this. Again, I think that we have an advantage that are really untapped and it's huge, which is the cross-border trade between African countries, which is, I think, non-existent now, or very minimum, where the potential is there. A lot of goods can actually move between different countries across Africa if we have the right infrastructure. I think the trade agreement has put maybe the incentive part of it, where there is now an agreement, customs can be removed and so on, but still we have issues around infrastructure that can be solved, part of it from the startups, part from the governments. But again, as I said, digital trade enabling platforms. So we need definitely to see this trade happening, this cross-border trade happening. We need solutions like digital freight, logistics, supply chain, platforms and companies, warehousing, fulfillment centers in different cities across a single country, or even, covering multiple countries to make sure that goods can move efficiently between one country to the other. So I think, these are the main sectors that we are excited about. We think that the next probably 10, 15 years, we'll see significant strides in these sectors and areas.
Exciting. So you touched on trends in areas such as food security, climate, energy, and digital trade. So if we stick to the theme of trends, what are the most exciting and promising technology trends that you're currently seeing on the continent?
Again, as I said, there is a move towards developing the infrastructure rather than the end service. So a lot of startups now are trying to focus on how to build, that's a major trend now, how to build an infrastructure, whether this is, let's say, logistics and supply chain infrastructure or a financial service infrastructure, which is, for me, it's important because I think that's the next step into the development of Africa. Rather than pushing, a consumer product and trying to get consumers to use this, startups now are trying to build the infrastructure that enable other companies to come and build or come and maybe integrate or come and maybe start doing business if they're an international company coming, let's say, from Europe or US, and they want to do business. So they tap into infrastructure plays to enable them to, day one, that they can do business. When companies like this, they come into the region, they need to see, there is an infrastructure for transportation, for logistics, for financial services, how to manage their payments, and so on. So I think one of the key words and key trends that I'm seeing now is building the infrastructure, whether in the financial services sector or the digital trade, which is, as I said, the freight, the movement of goods, movement of people, movements of capital. These are the main things that if it's there, it's by itself, it's an incentive or catalyst for other industries to start striving. So I think, that has been a major trend that I've started to see the past maybe 2 or 3 years.
Awesome. So if we look at it from the VC perspective, what trends in Africa's VC space are you seeing that you're excited about?
I think we've seen a lot of funds, African funds actually coming out the past 5 years. And I'm one of them, and I've seen a lot of actually funds being raised now locally from within Africa, which is I think very important, because as much as we need definitely external capital like VCs from Europe and US and so on, but we need to see a rise as well in the local VCs and the African founded VC firms, which is something, we started to see the past few years. And I think that's a trend that we're happy to see. Again, the more local VC funds we see, I think that's a better development and moving more towards a more mature, I would say, startup ecosystem across the continent. So it's something that I see as a very positive thing to be happening.
Brilliant. So if we move from trends and look at the future, where do you see Africa's VC space in the next 5 years' time?
I'm very optimistic in general, but still as well, I'm not a dreamer. I understand the challenges. I know there are a lot of challenges, but I think we are at kind of a historical moment where I think the people's will, the government's will to change things, startups are starting to realize that, and all three actually, they're aligned that we are the change. We need to see Africa different. We need to take responsibility and take ownership of this rather than depend on external countries or aid or whatever from the West to help ourselves. So I'm very optimistic about the future. And I think that with the rise, as I said, of local VCs across Africa, I think the next 5 years, there will be more, I would say, experienced and knowledgeable capital coming into the continent, into African startups, from African fund managers that definitely understand the specific of every country, whether it's a local VC, for example, in Nigeria, they understand Nigeria, a local VC in Egypt, and so on. So I think this will develop and transform the startups ecosystem and the future of Africa as well.
I agree. If we look closer to home, where do you see yourself and Jedar Capital in 5 years' time?
My focus is definitely Africa. So I think the next 5 or 10 years, I will be spending time in Africa. As I said, to build a legacy VC firm, an enduring VC firm, it's not just a fund. So probably we'll proceed and maybe move with other funds, a larger like Fund 2 and so on. whether to invest in more startups early stage, or maybe as well look at, kind of move upstream a little bit and move towards the growth stage of the startups. We're also have in mind to look in emerging markets in general, but this is something maybe in a little bit far in the future. But again, the next 5 years, definitely, I want to be spending more time in Africa and definitely focus on supporting the companies that we are investing in now.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, proverbs, or affirmations that keep us going when times are challenging or when times are good. Do you have one that you can share with us today?
A quote or a proverb. I don't have something really in mind now, but one of the affirmations that I have is driven from, sports and athletes. They have always been an inspiration to me. And I always like to talk as well about Kobe Bryant as one of them.
Yes.
Because I think his journey is very similar to the founder journey, or even as an investor as well, raising and, trying to build a VC firm from scratch and so on. Looking at this, that you start to realize, consistency is key.
Yes.
So you need to understand that you need to keep going, and you will keep going by being consistent regardless. You need to show up every day. Believe in the compounding effect, I would say, in the small progress you make on a daily basis. So every day, even if you're doing very slightly better than the day before, the compounding effect will mean that you will hit where you want to be. Just be consistent and focus on getting better every day and keep going. Don't stop, regardless of the challenges that you will have. You will have a lot of challenges, self-doubt, the imposter syndrome. You will have a lot of these during your journey. So you need to get up in the morning every day and keep going and be consistent. Don't stop.
Awesome. Fantastic. Thank you for sharing. I'm a big fan of Kobe Bryant and his kind of philosophy and approach to life and sports.
Yeah, I love him.
Yes, thank you for that. As we're at the end of today's conversation, do you have any closing remarks, final calls to action for people who are interested in the work that you're doing at Jedar Capital?
Thank you really for having me, Terser, and it has been an exciting conversation. I enjoyed it.
Me too.
Yeah, I would close this. Again, as I said, I'm very optimistic, very about the future of Africa. We're very reachable. We're happy to speak to people, whether people who are interested to understand more about Africa and investing in Africa, or founders who are building different solutions. They can reach us out on the website or personally on my LinkedIn profile. And happy to speak to people around Africa.
Brilliant. It's been a great conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. You've created an exciting company which has huge potential. So I'm looking forward to seeing how things develop and the massive impact that you'll make on the continent. So Sherif, thank you for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you, Terser. Thank you for having me.
It's been an absolute pleasure, and we will speak soon.
Looking forward. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you, and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.